The first bullet missed Maddie Calloway's head by half a second, just after she shoved the stranger out of his chair. She didn't know how to fire a gun. She didn't even know his name. Only a minute earlier, she had been on her knees scrubbing a stain of red wine from the thick carpet of the private dining room on the 40th floor, invisible, the way she had always been invisible, quietly counting down the hours until she could go home to the little girl waiting for her. Then she looked up. Beyond the enormous pane of glass, on the rooftop of the building across the street, a figure raised a long rifle and pressed it to his cheek. The barrel was aimed straight into the room. Aimed at the man seated at the head of the table, the man the entire room had held its breath for when he walked in. The man whose 2 door guards kept their hands at their sides, as if ready to draw something at any moment. Maddie had 1 second to choose. Run. That was the wise thing. She had a child waiting at home. She owed the stranger nothing at all, but she lunged forward instead. Get down. She slammed both hands into his shoulders and threw the full weight of her body into pushing him off the chair, and in that very instant, the window behind them shattered. Glass sprayed out like hail. Shouts erupted. Guns were pulled from holsters. Bodies dropped flat against the carpet. Maddie lay there, sprawled over a complete stranger, her heart pounding like a war drum, the sharp sting of gunpowder burning in her throat. When she dared to open her eyes, he was looking at her, gray eyes, cold as tempered steel. A faint scar running along his cheekbone. They were the eyes of a man who had spent his whole life watching others tremble before him, and yet now they were fixed on the face of the woman who had just risked her life to save him, as if he could not begin to understand why. All around them, an entire empire was screaming in chaos, and the most powerful man in the city simply lay still beneath the weight of a hotel maid, a woman he hadn't even known existed 1 minute before. She had just saved his life, and she had no idea that this single moment would drag both her and her little child into a world she had never once dared to imagine. If this opening pulled you in, leave a like and a share to help the story reach more people. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss a moment of the journey ahead. Everything that happened afterward unfolded so quickly that later, Maddie couldn't arrange it back into its proper order. One of the 2 door guards had dropped to his knees beside them, one arm shielding his boss, the other gripping a gun and aiming it toward the shattered window. The other man barked into the radio fastened at his cuff, his voice urgent but not panicked, calling out numbers and code names she didn't understand. 3 or 4 more men rushed in through the door at the far end of the room, spreading into the corners, pulling the curtains shut, killing the lights, turning the brightly lit room from a moment before into a dim block of darkness, with only the glow of the city spilling in. All of it happened within a few heartbeats, and in the middle of that spinning machinery that seemed like chaos, the man lying beneath her was the calmest one of all. He didn't struggle to get up. He didn't shout. He only tilted his head slightly, sweeping his eyes once across the room, as though counting his men, then slowly pushed himself upright, pulling Maddie with him, because she was still frozen stiff, clinging to the shoulder of his jacket without even realizing it. His hand settled on her wrist, gently loosening the fingers that were locked tight, and it was that steady touch, more than anything else, that dragged her back into the present. Maddie startled and let go, backing away until her spine struck the leg of the table. The boss rose to his feet. He brushed a splinter of glass from the shoulder of his jacket with a motion so strangely unhurried that it was as if he'd just stood up from a dinner interrupted by noise, not from a bullet that had skimmed past the place where he'd been sitting. An older man with salt and pepper hair hurried over and began speaking in a low voice, perhaps apologizing, perhaps reporting. Rowan Vance only lifted one finger. The man went silent in the middle of his sentence. Find the firing point. Rooftop of the building across the street, east side. He's already gone, but I want to know how he got in and who let him in. His voice was deep, even, without the slightest tremor. Lock down the elevators. No one leaves this building for the next half hour, and call someone to clean this up before any outsider has time to call the police. The gray-haired man nodded and immediately turned away to relay the orders. No one questioned him. No one hesitated. Maddie stood pressed into the corner of the wall, watching the scene with a coldness crawling down her spine in a way entirely different from the fear of the bullet a moment ago. This man had just nearly lost his life, and yet the only thing that had changed on his face was that his eyes were now a little darker, a little sharper, like water freezing beneath another layer of ice. She had met wealthy guests in this hotel before, people used to giving orders and used to being obeyed. But no one had ever made an entire room move around him so smoothly, with nothing more than a raised finger. She suddenly understood that the rumors she'd heard in passing along the staff hallways weren't embroidery. She should leave. Right now, while no one was paying attention to her, while the door at the far end of the room was still open, Maddie edged step by step along the wall, her eyes fixed on the floor, trying to shrink herself back into the shadow she had always been. Posey was waiting. The little girl would wake if Maddie came home late, would ask why her mother's hands were shaking. She didn't belong in this room. She didn't belong in a world of guns hidden beneath suit jackets and orders obeyed without question. "Where do you think you're going?" The question rose softly, almost curiously, but it pinned her feet to the floor. Maddie turned around. Rowan Vance was looking straight at her, and this time there was no trace of the stunned expression from the moment when the two of them had been lying on the floor. His gaze had returned to its calm, measuring stillness, as though he were looking at something that had appeared inside a problem he hadn't yet solved. "I'm sorry," she blurted, though she didn't know what she was apologizing for. "I'm only a housekeeper. I didn't see anything." "I don't know anything. I just want to go home. You just saved my life." He said it as a plain fact, not as a thank you. People usually run the other way from a bullet. You ran straight into it. "I want to know why." Maddie opened her mouth, then closed it again. She had no answer, not even for herself. "I don't know," she said honestly. Something flickered across his face, too fast for her to read. He stepped a little closer, and she had to lift her face to meet his eyes. "What's your name?" She hesitated. Every instinct told her not to say it, but under that gaze, the words came out before she could stop them. "Maddie." He repeated the name once, quietly, as if storing it somewhere for later use. "Maddie." Then he turned to the salt and pepper-haired man who had just returned. "Take her home safely. And Harlan, have someone watch the building she lives in tonight." Maddie meant to protest, meant to say she didn't need that she only wanted to disappear from here and forget everything that had happened. But he had already turned away, already stepped toward the men waiting for his orders, leaving her standing there with the strange feeling that her life had just turned down a road she had never chosen. The black car dropped her off at the mouth of the alley that led into the boarding house, and the quiet driver only gave her a single nod when she murmured her thanks, then lingered at the curb as if he'd been instructed to do so, the headlights still on, waiting until she had disappeared completely behind the door. Maddie climbed 4 flights of stairs because the building's elevator had been broken since last winter and no one had bothered to repair it, each step giving off its familiar creak, and by the time she slipped the key into the lock of her small apartment, both her hands were still trembling, not from the climb, but because whatever remained of that evening still hadn't agreed to leave her body. Inside, a night lamp cast a warm yellow glow, and Mrs. Delacroix, the elderly neighbor who always watched Posey for her during night shifts, was sitting on the old sofa, halfway through knitting a scarf. She looked up, placed a finger against her lips, then smiled softly. The little girl was very good. She finished her bowl of soup before she agreed to go to sleep. She asked about her mother a few times, but I told her Mommy would be home soon, and then she hugged her bear and drifted off. Maddie nodded, forcing a smile so the older woman wouldn't notice anything unusual, pressing a little babysitting money into her hand even though the woman kept refusing it, then walking her across the hall to the apartment opposite hers. When the door closed and the room held no one but her, Maddie finally let herself lean back against the wall and release a long breath, feeling as if she'd been holding it for hours. She stepped quietly toward the half-open doorway of the bedroom. Inside, beneath the blanket printed with rabbits that had faded from being washed too many times, Posey lay curled in on herself, one hand still holding tight to the worn stuffed bear, her soft brown hair spilled across the pillow, her breathing steady and peaceful. Maddie knelt beside the bed, reaching out to brush the loose strands of hair from her daughter's forehead, and that small moment alone was enough to melt away some part of the terror still clinging inside her chest. The child was 6 years old, smaller than other children her age, her little cheeks still faintly pale, in a way that no number of good nights of sleep could entirely erase. But when she slept, her face looked so serene that a person could almost forget that inside that small chest was a heart that wasn't whole like other hearts. The doctor had explained it to Maddie when the child was only 3, using words it had taken her many nights to fully understand, that Posey's heart had a congenital defect, a small hole between 2 chambers that time wouldn't close on its own, that the little girl needed surgery to repair it before she grew any more, and everything became more complicated. They had scheduled it. This fall, when Posey turned 7 and had gained enough weight, the doctors at the children's hospital would perform the operation. It was a surgery they said had a very high success rate, a procedure that skilled hands performed regularly every week. And every time Maddie heard that, she clung to the word hope as if it were a lifeline. There was only one thing standing between her daughter and the healthy heart she deserved, and that thing was money. The number the hospital had given her was so large that the first time Maddie saw it on the paper, she had to read it again and again, 3 times, to make sure she hadn't misunderstood. Her meager insurance would cover only a small corner of it, and the rest was an entire mountain she was climbing $1 at a time, through night shifts stitched onto day shifts, through tips she tucked away inside the tin box hidden behind the kitchen drawer, through telling herself that if she just tried a little harder, worked a little more, went without a little longer, she would make it in time. She bent down and pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead, and Posey stirred faintly, her eyes still closed, her mouth whispering Mommy in a dream before she sank back into deep sleep. "I'm here," Maddie whispered back, though the little girl could no longer hear her. "I'm home with you now." She sat there for a long time at the edge of the bed, listening to her daughter's breathing in the quiet room, and letting the world of bullets and powerful men drift far away from her mind, so far that she could almost believe tonight had never happened, that tomorrow she would wake up and everything would still be exactly as it had been before, small, difficult, but hers, and safe. While Maddie sat beside her daughter's bed in the 4th-floor apartment of the boarding house, nearly 20 kilometers away, inside a mansion, set behind towering iron gates and rows of trees trimmed into perfect lines, Rowan Vance still hadn't gone to sleep. He stood beside the large window of his study on the 2nd floor, an untouched glass of amber liquor held loosely in his hand, looking out over the dark courtyard, where the shadows of guards moved silently along carefully calculated patrol routes. His left shoulder ached dully where it had struck the floor when he was shoved down, but physical pain wasn't what kept him awake. He had lived too long in a world where death was a possibility written into every meeting, where every door he stepped through had someone go ahead to inspect it first. Every dish placed before him had someone taste it, and every person who came near him carried a motive he had to uncover before they had the chance to speak. In that world, he understood the rules of the game. People feared him, people obeyed him, people flattered him, and when given the chance, people betrayed him. Those were reactions he could predict, classify, and guard against. What he hadn't been able to predict, what kept circling back through his mind for hours afterward, was the image of a thin woman in a housekeeping uniform. A woman who didn't know him, who owed him nothing, who had no reason on earth to risk her life for him, yet had thrown herself straight into the path of a bullet to shove him out of the line of fire. People didn't do that. In the experience of his entire life, no one did that. His bodyguards did it because that was the job they were paid to do. The men under him risked themselves because loyalty was always weighed against benefit. But that woman had nothing to gain and everything to lose. And still, she had done it. A knock at the door cut through his thoughts. Silas stepped in, a man a few years younger than him, with the unhurried walk of someone who had long been accustomed to entering this room. The right-hand man Rowan trusted more than anyone else in the organization, the only person allowed to carry a gun while standing in front of him. Harlan's men finished sweeping the rooftop of the building across the street, Silas said, placing a thin folder on the desk. Professional sniper. Clean entry and exit. He left nothing behind except a few shell casings. We're tracing it, but it'll take time. Rowan nodded without turning around. And the woman? There was a very brief silence. So brief that if Rowan hadn't spent years learning to read every pause in the men beneath him, he might not have noticed it. "What do you want to track her down for?" Silas asked, his voice still light, almost concerned. "She's just a housekeeper who happened to be there. Luck, that's all. I think you should forget about her. The fewer outsiders tangled up in our business, the better, especially right now, when we still don't know who was behind tonight's attack. A strange face showing up around you will only add trouble." Rowan turned, set the glass of liquor down on the desk, and looked at his right-hand man a moment longer than usual. The advice was reasonable. It fit every rule of caution he himself had taught the people under him. He should have nodded and agreed. "Find her name," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Find out where she lives, what she does, who she has. I want to know everything about the woman who put her own life between me and a bullet. And Silas, I'm not used to owing anyone a debt, especially a debt I haven't yet understood why I have." Silas looked at him for another second, then smiled and bowed his head to accept the order as he always did. "Yes, I'll handle it." The door closed behind him, and Rowan turned back toward the window, completely unaware that the man who had just accepted the order to find Maddie was also the very man who had a reason to hope she would never be found. It took less than 2 days for Silas's men to place a file on Rowan's desk, filled with the woman's full name, address, workplace, and circumstances, and it took Rowan one more afternoon to decide that he would go find her himself, instead of sending someone with money, the way he usually handled every other debt. Maddie was wiping down a row of tables in the restaurant, on the ground floor of the hotel, when she looked up and saw him standing there, with no bodyguards flanking him, no showy air from that night, just one man alone in a dark suit, and her whole body instantly went rigid, as if someone had poured ice water over her. She glanced around, afraid someone might recognize him, afraid of the trouble his presence could bring, then hurried toward him and lowered her voice. "You shouldn't have come here. If my manager sees you, if anything else happens here, I'll lose my job." "Then we'll speak quickly," Rowan replied, his voice calm, as if this place belonged to him rather than being the place where she sweated to earn her living. He drew a thick envelope from inside his jacket, set it on the table she had just wiped, and pushed it toward her with 2 fingers. "I'm not used to owing debts. You did something very few people in this world would dare to do, and I pay what I owe. There's enough in here for you never to set foot in this hotel again if you don't want to. Take it." Maddie looked down at the envelope, and for one very brief moment, she saw everything that money could become. Posey's mountain of hospital bills suddenly seemed lower. The long night shifts suddenly seemed shorter. The tin box hidden behind the kitchen drawer suddenly no longer had to count every single dollar. She saw all of it, and then she pushed the envelope back toward him. "I can't take it." Rowan frowned. And for the first time in their conversation, something was not unfolding according to the script he had imagined. "Do you know how much is in here?" "I don't need to know," she answered, and though her voice was soft, it didn't tremble. "If I take that money, then what I did that night becomes something else. It becomes a transaction. You pay, I accept, and that's the end of it. Both sides are even, but I didn't save you to be paid. I did it because in that moment, I couldn't stand there and watch a person die right in front of me without doing anything. If you give me money, you'll take away the only thing that made it mean something." Rowan stood still. In an entire lifetime spent among people who always wanted something from him, people who calculated how much advantage they could squeeze out of any connection with him, he had grown used to one simple truth, that everything in the world had a price, and his job was only to find that price and pay it. People sold loyalty, sold silence, even sold dignity, as long as the number was high enough. Yet the thin woman standing before him, the woman he knew from the file was carrying a debt that could drown her whole life, had just pushed that lifeline back without blinking, not because she didn't need it, but because she believed some invisible thing was worth more. "You're a strange woman, Maddie," he said at last, and this time there was no command in his voice, only something close to honest curiosity. "Most people would have snatched this envelope before I even had the chance to put it down." "Maybe so," Maddie said, picking up the envelope and placing it back in his hand, closing his fingers around it with quiet firmness. "But I'm not most people, and I don't sell what I've already given freely. Thank you, but I have to get back to work." She turned away, took up the cleaning cloth, and continued the work she had left unfinished, as if the conversation had never happened, leaving the most powerful man in the city standing there with an envelope in his hand, and the entirely unfamiliar feeling that, for the first time in many years, he had just encountered something his money couldn't touch. The next morning, Maddie had barely put her purse into the employee locker when someone told her that the manager, Garrett Brandt, wanted to see her immediately in his office, and the tone of the messenger's voice alone was enough to make her stomach tighten. Garrett was the kind of man who enjoyed the small scrap of power his position as night shift manager gave him, the kind of man who always found some fault to dock wages over, some rule to remind people of, and the way he looked at housekeeping staff like her made it clear that in his eyes they were only slightly above objects. When she stepped inside, he didn't invite her to sit. He only leaned back in his leather chair, tapping his pen against the desk. "Do you know how many times I had to explain myself to upper management that night, Calloway?" he began, his voice dangerously smooth. "A shooting inside a private banquet room of this hotel. The police were almost called. If the press had caught the scent of it, this whole hotel would have been finished. And you, a housekeeper, were right in the middle of the storm, running straight toward the most important guest of the evening. "I was only trying to help," Maddie said softly. "Someone was trying to shoot him. I couldn't just stand still." "Help," Garrett laughed. A laugh with no warmth in it at all. "Who do you think you are? Your job is to mop floors and change bed sheets, not play hero. Do you understand that because you caused a scene, the entire night security procedure is now being reviewed? And your name is sitting there in every report." He leaned forward and lowered his voice. "I could have fired you immediately, but I'm going to be generous. Starting this week, all your night shifts are cut. You'll only have day shifts left, and 1/3 of your pay will be deducted for the next 3 months as compensation for the trouble you caused. If you don't like it, that door is always open." Maddie felt her face go cold. Cutting her night shifts meant cutting away the night differential that made up the largest part of her income. Taking 1/3 of her pay meant the tin box behind the kitchen drawer would stop growing heavier. It meant the fall she had been counting down to day by day had suddenly moved farther away, beyond her reach. She thought of Posey, of the surgery date written on the hospital paper, of her daughter's pale face while she slept, and she had to clasp her hands together tightly to keep her voice from breaking. "Mr. Brandt, please. I need those night shifts. I have a little girl. She's sick. I need that money more than you can imagine. I'll do anything. I'll take extra shifts. I'm only asking you not to cut my pay." Something flashed in Garrett's eyes when he heard her plead. Not quite pity, but the satisfaction of a man who had just seen his prey shrink exactly the way he wanted. But then he did something strange. He glanced quickly toward the phone on his desk, as if he had just remembered something. And then his voice changed, becoming harder and, in some inexplicable way, more cautious. "The decision isn't entirely mine, Calloway. There are people higher up than you think keeping an eye on this matter, and they want your name gone from here as soon as possible. I'm only trying to keep you employed. You'd better know your place." He waved a hand to dismiss her, and Maddie walked out of the office with legs as heavy as lead, unable to understand why an unknown housekeeper like her could possibly concern people so high above her, and never suspecting that Garrett's careless words had just revealed a truth she wouldn't piece together until much later. Rowan Vance was not a man who missed information, and the fact that a woman who had just refused a fortune from him was now being squeezed by someone else because of the very night she had saved his life was the kind of information that would not stay out of his ears for long. His men had still been quietly watching the building where she lived, following the order he had given on that first night. And with only a few questions placed in the right corners, he had the whole story about Garrett Brandt, about the docked pay, about the night shifts taken away, about the threat of dismissal. So 2 days later, during the quiet hour of the afternoon when there were few guests, Garrett was sitting in his office when the door opened without a knock, and the man who stepped inside made him spring up from his chair so quickly he nearly knocked over the coffee cup on his desk. Garrett recognized him instantly, not because they had met, but because there were faces anyone doing business in this city had to know well enough to avoid, and Rowan Vance's face was at the very top of that list. "Mr. Vance," he stammered, forcing out a smile. "What an honor. I had no idea you would be stopping by. How may I help you?" Rowan didn't answer right away. He calmly closed the door behind him, pulled out a chair, and sat down across from Garrett without hurry. And it was precisely that lack of hurry that made sweat begin to bead on the manager's forehead. He placed a thin file on the desk, said nothing, and only pushed it toward Garrett with one finger, the same gesture he had used a few days earlier to push the envelope toward Maddie, except this time what lay inside was not a favor. "I'm a man who likes to look closely into anyone who bothers the things I care about," Rowan began, his voice even, almost leisurely. "You have an interesting habit, Mr. Brandt, inflating employee work hours, then pocketing the difference, docking people's pay for faults that don't exist, then recording it as fines. There are also a few cash deposits into your personal account that your superiors would certainly be very curious to know the source of. I could keep reading, but I think you understand my point." Garrett's face went white. He reached out and turned a few pages in the file, and with every page he turned, his hands shook a little more, because inside were figures, dates, and bank statements that no one but him should have known about, arranged so neatly that there was no room left for denial. "What do you want?" he whispered. Every trace of arrogance evaporated clean away. "Not much," Rowan replied. "There's a housekeeper named Maddie Calloway. You cut her night shifts, docked her pay, and threatened to fire her. I want everything returned to the way it was by this afternoon. Her night shifts are restored. Her salary is paid in full, and the portion already deducted is returned as well. More than that, from this moment on, if I hear even one word that she has been given trouble in this place, whether by you or by anyone you think is standing behind you, this file will be on the desk of your superiors, the tax authorities, and a few other people you won't want to meet. One nod from me, Mr. Brandt, and everything you have will be gone. Do you understand? Garrett nodded again and again, sweat already soaking the collar of his shirt. I understand. I understand. There won't be any more problems. I promise. Rowan stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and before turning away, he paused for a moment. One more thing. I heard you mention people higher up who wanted her gone. I'd very much like to know who they are. Garrett opened his mouth, then closed it again, real panic flashing through his eyes, as if the fear of the man standing before him was still less than the fear of someone else. I don't know. Truly. It was only a few phone calls. They didn't give a name. Rowan looked at him for another second, storing that fear away in one corner of his mind, then walked out. And that very afternoon, when Maddie was told that her night shifts had been restored and the deducted pay would be returned in full without a single explanation, she stood motionless in the employee hallway for a long time, unable to understand why, only vaguely feeling that some invisible hand had just quietly shielded her. The fragile sense of peace Maddie tried to cling to did not last even a full week before she realized for the first time that she was being watched. At first, it was only small things, little details she almost managed to convince herself she had imagined. A dark car parked at the mouth of the alley longer than usual. A man she saw twice in the same day in two different places. The prickling feeling at the back of her neck every time she walked out of the hotel doors at the end of her shift. She told herself she was panicking for no reason, that after a terrifying night like that, anyone would startle at every shadow. But then one evening, when she had just picked Posey up from Mrs. Delacroix's apartment and was leading her daughter up the stairs, a man she had never met was already waiting on the second-floor landing, blocking the way with a smile that never reached his eyes. Maddie instinctively pushed Posey behind her, one hand tightening around her daughter's small hand, and the little girl, sensing the stiffness in her mother's body, obediently pressed close, without saying a word. Miss Calloway, the man said, his voice gentle, though every word was cold as stone. You're a very hard woman to find, but not as hard as you think. I only stopped by to give you a message. That night in the banquet room, you saw things a housekeeper was never meant to see, and you did things you should never have gotten involved in. There are people who would very much like to know exactly what you saw and whom you've told. My advice is that you forget everything. Forget that night. Forget the man you saved. Forget all of it, because a mother has far more to lose than just herself. You understand what I mean, don't you? His eyes slid down to Posey for only an instant, but that instant was enough to freeze the blood in Maddie's veins, and then he stepped back, nodded politely as if they had merely exchanged a few casual words, walked down the stairs, and vanished into the night. Maddie stood rooted there for a long while, her heart pounding. Then she scooped Posey into her arms, hurried into the apartment, locked the door, slid the safety bolt into place, and sank down onto the floor just behind it, holding her daughter tight, while the little girl asked in confusion if Mommy was all right. That night, Maddie couldn't sleep at all. She had faced poverty, exhausting shifts that wrung her dry, and the worry of hospital bills pressing heavier on her day after day. And she had always managed somehow, always found a way, because no matter how harsh those things were, they threatened only her. But this was something entirely different. This was an invisible hand that had reached the threshold of her home, had looked down at her daughter, and for the first time in her life, she understood that there were dangers. Her hard work and courage alone could never hold back. The next morning, when she had just stepped out the door with dark circles under her eyes from a sleepless night, a familiar car was already parked across the street, and Rowan Vance stepped out as if he had known, as if he always knew. My men told me a stranger came looking for you last night, he said. And this time his voice no longer carried the distant composure of their earlier meetings, but something sharpened, almost angry, though that anger was clearly not aimed at her. What did he say to you? Maddie meant to open her mouth and say she was fine, that she could handle it herself, because that was the answer she had been used to giving all her life. But this time, the words caught in her throat, because behind her, inside that apartment, was Posey, and she no longer had the right to place her pride above her daughter's safety. He looked at my daughter, she said, and her voice finally broke. He looked at her, Mr. Vance. I'm not afraid for myself, but she didn't do anything to deserve this." Rowan stepped closer, and when he spoke, his voice had softened into a firm promise. "Then listen to me. I can't erase what you accidentally became part of, but I can protect you and your little girl from it. Let me take both of you somewhere no hand can reach. I know you have no reason to trust a man like me, but right now, I'm the only thing standing between your daughter and those people." And Maddie, forced for the first time in her life to place her fate in someone else's hands, looked into those gray eyes for a long moment, then gave a small nod. Rowan Vance's mansion sat at the end of a tree-shaded road in the northern outskirts of the city, behind tall gates and a front yard so wide that Maddie thought her entire boarding house could have fit inside it with room still left over. And when the car rolled through the gate and onto the white gravel drive, she sat silently beside the window, one hand still holding Posey's, unable to believe that places like this existed only a few dozen kilometers away from her world. Everything here gave off a quiet, imposing grandeur. The pale stone walls, the windows that reached from floor to ceiling, the rows of trees cared for down to every leaf, and inside were vast rooms with soaring ceilings and polished stone floors so glossy that Maddie was almost afraid to step on them, her old worn shoes looking painfully out of place against that surface. She stood tucked into the middle of the foyer, her shoulders drawn in slightly with the habit of someone who had spent her whole life making herself smaller in spaces that didn't belong to her, and she tightened her hand around her daughter's a little more, as if afraid that the poverty clinging to the two of them might stain this place. But Posey carried none of that shyness inside her. Children don't look at the world through the lens of wealth and poverty, status and shame. And with the wide, bright eyes of a 6-year-old, all she saw before her was a vast and magical place waiting to be explored. She slipped her hand free from her mother's, trotted a few steps across the stone floor, lifted her face to gaze at the crystal chandelier hanging high above, then giggled when she saw tiny flecks of light dancing across the wall. Then she spun around, ran toward a large window that looked out over the garden, pressed her whole little face to the glass, and cried out that there was a red bird perched on a branch outside. Rowan, who had just entered the foyer after giving his men a few instructions, stopped at the threshold and watched the scene with a strange expression, as if he didn't know what to do with such a small, carefree creature running through a house that for so long had echoed only with the footsteps of armed men and whispered conversations about power and calculation. Hearing his footsteps, Posey turned to look at him, and instead of being afraid, the way every adult she had ever met had taught a child to keep her distance from strangers, she simply tilted her head and studied him curiously for a moment before giving him a radiant smile. "Mister, your house is so big. Do you keep that red bird out there? It's so pretty." Rowan opened his mouth, then paused, and for one moment, the man who always had an answer ready for every situation suddenly seemed unsure what to say before a question that simple. "I don't keep it," he finally replied, his voice carrying a rare hesitation. "But it likes to perch in that tree. You can look at it any time you want." Posey nodded, as if satisfied with the answer, then turned back to the window and continued staring at the bird, innocent as though this place had been her home for a long time. Maddie stood there and witnessed all of it. Witnessed the way the most powerful man in the city grew awkward before her daughter. Witnessed a brief softening in those gray eyes that were usually cold as steel, and for the first time since stepping through those iron gates, she felt that perhaps this place wasn't quite as frightening as she had believed. Rowan caught her gaze, and for one fleeting second, between the two adults, without the need for a single word, something was given and received. A quiet admission that perhaps they had both just recognized they were standing before something neither of them fully understood. That night, after Posey had fallen sound asleep in the spacious room that had been prepared for mother and daughter, Maddie lay awake for a long while on the unfamiliar softness of the bed, then finally got up, quietly stepped outside to look for a glass of water. And it was while she was feeling her way through the dark corridors of that enormous house that she found Rowan sitting alone in his study, the desk lamp casting a warm yellow circle of light across his face, a glass of unfinished liquor set near his hand, his eyes fixed on the empty space before him as if he were looking at something very distant, very old. She meant to turn away silently so she wouldn't disturb him, but the floorboard gave a soft creak beneath her foot, and he looked up. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I was only looking for some water. I didn't mean to bother you." "You're not bothering me," Rowan replied, and he gestured toward the chair across from him. an invitation she hesitated over for a moment before accepting, sitting down on the edge of the seat with both hands resting on her knees. They sat in silence for a while, a silence that wasn't suffocating, but strangely carried something almost familiar. And then Rowan was the one who spoke first, his voice low and slow, as if those words had been inside him for a very long time and had never been spoken to anyone. "Have you ever wondered why I was so insistent on finding you?" he said, his eyes still fixed on the pool of light on the desk. "Why I couldn't simply send you money and forget about it, the way I've done with everything else in my life. I asked myself that question many times, and only recently did I understand." He turned the glass lightly in his hand, and in that moment, his eyes, usually cold as steel, seemed covered by something softer, something more wounded. "I once had a little sister. She was much younger than I was. And back then, I was still young, still weak. Not the man I am now. One night, she was harmed. Right in the middle of a crowded place, and I watched an entire crowd stand by and stare. Everyone saw, everyone knew what was happening, but not one person stepped forward. They were afraid of trouble, afraid of being dragged into it, afraid of paying the price for interfering in someone else's business. And while all of them stood there calculating whether they should get involved, it became too late." He stopped, and Maddie said nothing. She only waited quietly, because she understood that there were wounds a person had to walk through alone, wounds no one else could carry for them. From that night on, I told myself I would become a man. No one would dare stand by and watch. A man powerful enough that I would never again have to depend on another person's kindness, because I had learned that selfless kindness doesn't exist, that everyone measures the cost before reaching out, and the price of a human life is often too high for people to be willing to pay. At last, he turned to look at her, and that look made her heart tighten faintly. "Then you appeared, a woman who didn't know me, who owed me nothing, who had a child waiting at home and an entire life to lose, and yet you ran toward that bullet without calculating for even half a second. You did the very thing I had spent my whole life believing no one would ever do, and you did it for a stranger." Maddie felt her throat close, and she shook her head slightly. "In that moment, I wasn't thinking at all, Mr. Vance. I'm not brave. I just couldn't bear the thought of standing there and watching someone die when there was still something I could do. Maybe it's because I'm a mother too. I always think that if one day my child needs someone to save her, I'll pray there's still someone in this world willing to do it." Rowan looked at her for a long time after that, and something in his face softened. The layer of ice he had spent so many years building around himself suddenly cracking along one very small line, just enough for her to glimpse the real man hidden behind all that power. And they both sat there in the warm yellow glow of the lamp without saying another word. But between them, something fragile had just begun to stir, something neither of them yet dared to name. The following days passed in a kind of peace Maddie had not dared to dream of for a very long time, a strange stillness in the middle of her life, where fear still existed but was held outside the stone walls, and inside there was a slower rhythm of living that she had almost forgotten could exist at all. What surprised her most was not the luxury of the house, but the way the most powerful man in the city gradually allowed her little daughter to draw him out of the cold shell he had worn around himself for so long. One afternoon, she went looking for Posy, and found the little girl sitting on the rug in the reading room, surrounded by all kinds of colored pencils, commanding Rowan to color a dinosaur in her coloring book the right way. And the man the whole city feared was holding a green crayon awkwardly in his large hand, a hand used to holding very different things, frowning in concentration as if he were solving a matter of great importance, while Posy sternly reminded him that he had colored outside the lines and needed to be more careful. Maddie stood in the doorway, one hand covering her mouth to hide her smile. And when Rowan looked up and caught her gaze, instead of looking embarrassed, he only gave a small shrug, as if to say he didn't understand how he had ended up in this situation either, and it was that deeply human gesture that softened her heart a little more. Little by little, the walls she had built around herself began to come down too. She found herself telling him things she had never told anyone, about the difficult years of raising her child alone, about the constant fear that lived inside her whenever she thought of Posy's surgery, even about the small dreams she kept hidden, that one day her daughter would be able to run and play like other children, without having to stop and catch her breath. And Rowan, a man used to listening in order to find an opponent's weakness, listened to her in an entirely different way, not to exploit anything, but simply to understand. Sometimes, he told her small things about himself in return, little stories that had nothing to do with power or money, and each one lifted a corner of the man he had kept hidden beneath his suit jacket and steel-gray eyes. One evening, when the three of them were sitting together in the garden watching the sunset fall, Posey dozed off on her mother's lap after a day of running and playing, and Maddie caught Rowan looking at mother and daughter with an expression she had never seen on him before, a tenderness mixed with a quiet longing, as if he were gazing at something he had believed he would never be able to reach in his entire life. And in that moment, she understood that something real was growing between them, fragile but true. But even in those peaceful days, there was still a shadow Maddie did not notice, because each time she and Rowan laughed together, each time Posey tugged him by the hand out into the garden, each time that strange warmth spread through the house that had once been so cold, somewhere in a hidden corner, Silas still stood silently watching. His face revealed nothing, but his eyes followed the three of them with a look that was hard to read, a quiet calculation hidden beneath his usual composure. And once, when Maddie accidentally caught that gaze sliding past her, only for an instant, it was enough to send a faint chill down her spine that she couldn't explain. Then she pushed it aside, telling herself she was worrying too much, never knowing that her instincts had just come very close to a truth she was not yet ready to see. While quiet warmth was growing inside the house, Rowan had not stopped for a single day hunting the one who had sent the sniper to take his life, and the information network he had built over so many years finally began returning the first pieces of the puzzle, one by one, until the picture slowly came into focus and made even him unwilling to believe what he was seeing. They traced the sniper through the shell casings left behind, then traced the sniper to the middleman who had hired him, then traced that middleman to streams of money laundered through so many refined layers that only someone who understood the internal workings of the organization in detail could have constructed them. And with every clue they pulled loose, Rowan was led closer to a truth he had been unconsciously avoiding for weeks. The final piece came from Garrett Brandt himself, the man who, after his confrontation with Rowan, had been living in constant fear, and when Rowan's men came for him again, he confessed everything with something almost like relief, that the calls ordering him to make trouble for Maddie, the reminders that someone higher up wanted her gone, all of it had come from one single number. And when Rowan had his people trace that number back, it led straight to the one man he had trusted more completely than anyone else in the world, Silas. That night, Rowan summoned him to the study, and when Silas entered with his usual unhurried ease, Rowan only silently placed each photograph, each recording, each money trail on the desk, spreading them out like a hand of cards that had finally reached the moment of being turned face up. He watched the face of the man he had once considered a younger brother, looking for even one faint hope that he had been wrong. But Silas didn't deny it. He looked down at the evidence laid bare across the desk, then slowly lifted his head. And what chilled Rowan was not the admission itself, but the calmness on that face, almost relief, as if Silas had been waiting for this moment for a long time. "Do you know what the hardest part was? Standing behind you for 15 years, Rowan?" Silas said, his voice still gentle, though now it carried a bitterness he had kept carefully hidden all this time. "It was watching you take all the glory while I did half the work in the dark. It was watching you make every major decision yourself, walk through every important door yourself, while I remained forever the shadow behind you, reliable, useful, and invisible. I built half of this empire with my own hands, and yet in your eyes, I was still only the man who carried out orders. I didn't want to be a shadow anymore." Rowan stood motionless, and inside the pain of that betrayal was something else as well, a late realization that perhaps, through all those years spent strengthening his power, he truly had failed to see the man standing closest to him, had treated Silas's loyalty as something obvious without once asking what it had cost. "So you hired someone to kill me," Rowan said, his voice sinking lower, "and staged the scene to look like revenge from an outside enemy, so that when I fell, you would become the rightful successor, with clean hands and no suspicion." "It would have been clean," Silas replied, his eyes darkening for a moment, "if that housekeeper hadn't interfered. A variable I didn't calculate. She saved you, and she instantly became a dangerous variable, a witness who could trace the hit back to me. I tried to eliminate her quietly by squeezing her out of the hotel through Brandt, but when you started digging into her life and brought her under your wing, my window was closing. As long as she remained alive, she was a pair of eyes that knew too much." Hearing that, the blood in Rowan's body seemed to freeze, because he understood at once that the threats aimed at Maddie, the shadow waiting on the stairs, the glance that slid over Posey, All of it had been the work of the very man standing before him, and for the first time in the conversation, his composure cracked into something far more dangerous. "You made a mistake, Silas," he said, each word cold as ice. "You aimed at me, and I can understand that. But you aimed at a child and her mother, and with that, you chose your own ending." But Silas only smiled, a smile that made Rowan suddenly understand that this confrontation was nowhere near finished, that the traitor had gone much farther than he had imagined, and that perhaps his most dangerous pieces still had not been turned over. The news came on a morning that had seemed as ordinary as any other morning in the peaceful days just past. When Maddie took Posey to the follow-up appointment the doctor had scheduled in advance, an appointment she had still believed was only a routine formality, until she saw the doctor's expression change as the woman reviewed her daughter's newest test results. The doctor explained to her in a gentle but serious voice that Posey's little heart was having to work harder than it had during previous examinations, that the congenital defect had reached a stage where they could no longer wait until the fall as originally planned, that the surgery needed to be performed soon, within the next few weeks, to make sure the little girl had the best chance to recover and keep growing strong like other children. The doctor reassured her that this was still an operation with a very hopeful outlook, that the hospital team had successfully performed countless similar procedures, and that the most important thing now was simply not to delay any longer. Maddie sat there, holding the hand of her daughter, who was cheerfully swinging her legs on the examination chair without any idea what the adults were discussing, and she nodded, trying to smile, trying to keep her voice steady as she thanked the doctor. But inside her chest, an entire storm was rising, because sooner meant she no longer had the months to save money that she had been counting on. It meant the mountain of hospital bills she had been climbing $1 at a time had suddenly risen right in front of her, higher than ever and closer than ever. That night, after she had tucked Posey into bed and kissed her forehead as usual, Maddie sat alone at the small table in the room, took out everything she had saved, and counted it again and again, as if somehow the numbers might multiply on their own if she counted them enough times. But no matter how she arranged them, the distance between the money she had and the money she needed was still an abyss she could see no way to cross in a few short weeks. For the first time after so many years of forcing herself to be the steady place her daughter could lean on, Maddie lowered her head into her hands and let the tears she had always hidden finally spill out, not because she was weak, but because she had been strong for too long, and this time that strength still seemed not to be enough. She didn't know that Rowan had been standing in the doorway for some time, that he had heard enough to understand everything, and that the sight of that resilient woman breaking down in solitude had carved something into his heart more deeply than any words ever could. He did not step inside to comfort her. He did not break that private moment of hers. He only quietly withdrew into the darkness of the hallway. And the next morning, when Maddie woke with her eyes still swollen, she saw that Rowan had left early. People said he had matters to handle, and throughout that entire day he was absent. Only once did she glimpse him standing at the end of the hallway, a phone pressed to his ear, speaking in a low, clipped voice to someone on the other end. When he caught her gaze, he only gave a small nod, then turned away and continued the call, leaving her with the vague feeling that something was happening that she could not yet understand, that some invisible gear had begun to turn silently, and she was too exhausted, too drowned in her own worry to try to understand it, never suspecting that at the very moment she believed she was most alone in the middle of this storm, someone had already quietly placed the full weight of himself behind her, carrying part of the burden she had always believed was hers alone to bear. The truth came to Maddie a few days later, not through Rowan's words, because he was the kind of man who never spoke of the good things he did, but through a phone call from the hospital one afternoon while she was sitting with Posey in the garden. The caller was a records officer from the Children's Hospital, her voice gentle as she informed Maddie that the entire cost of Posey's surgery had been paid in full, that the operation had been scheduled with the very top heart surgeon, whose waiting list normally stretched for months, that she didn't need to worry about a single expense anymore, because everything had been completely taken care of by an anonymous benefactor. Maddie stood frozen in the middle of the garden, the phone pressed to her ear, and the person on the other end had to repeat it twice before she dared to believe what she had just heard, because it was too great, beyond anything she had ever dared to pray for, beyond even the mountain she had spent so many years desperately forcing herself to climb. She stammered and asked who it was, who had done this, but the person on the line only answered that the donor wished to remain unnamed. that they had simply been told to pass along the message that the little girl deserved a chance to grow up healthy. And that sentence alone was enough for Maddie to understand everything. Because it was exactly what she had once confessed to Rowan on some quiet evening, that small dream that one day her daughter would be able to run and play like every other child without having to stop to catch her breath. She lowered the phone, her legs giving way, and she found him in the study, where he was standing beside the window just as he had been on that first night when she had happened upon him alone. And when he turned and saw her face soaked with tears, he understood that she knew. "It was you," she said, her voice breaking. "You paid for all of it. You arranged everything. You did it without saying a word to me." Rowan did not deny it. He only looked at her in silence, and when he spoke, his voice was low and strangely gentle. "I didn't want you to feel indebted to me. That's why I didn't tell you. You refused my money once because, to you, dignity is worth more than ease, and I respect that more than you know. But this isn't repayment, Maddie. This isn't a transaction. A child needs to live, and I have the means to make that happen. It's as simple as that." Maddie stepped toward him, and every barrier she had built between them for so long, every layer of caution, every distance between her world and his, all of it suddenly collapsed in that moment. "This whole city is afraid of you," she said through her tears. "People have told me what kind of man you are, how ruthless you are, how terrifying you are, and yet you're the only person in the world who stood behind me when I fell apart. The only person who reached out a hand without asking for anything in return. I don't know how to understand you anymore, Rowan." "Then don't try to understand," he replied. And for the first time, he lifted his hand, hesitated, then gently wiped a tear from her cheek with a tenderness that perhaps even he hadn't known he possessed. "Maybe I am the man people say I am, but when I'm with you and the little girl, I feel like someone I lost a very long time ago, someone I thought had died completely inside me. You gave that back to me, Maddie, without even knowing it, and in that silent room, beneath the fading afternoon light pouring through the large window, two people from two worlds that seemed never meant to touch finally stood there with no boundary left between them, no caution left, only two hearts realizing that amid all the wreckage and danger of life, they had found each other. Posey's surgery day finally arrived, and that morning at the children's hospital, the little girl was taken into the preparation area under the devoted care of an entire team of the finest doctors and nurses, surrounded by kind faces. Maddie held her tightly before they took her away, telling her that Mommy would be right here waiting when she woke up, that when she opened her eyes, her heart would be healthy, and she would be able to run and play as much as she wanted. And Posey, brave in the way only children can be, smiled and nodded, then waved goodbye to her mother before the doors to the operating area closed, leaving the little girl safely in the hands of those who would heal her. Rowan had arranged for two of his most trusted men to stand watch outside the operating wing, and he had intended to stay beside Maddie through the entire wait. But just then his phone rang, and the voice on the other end made his face harden. It was Silas. He said he had something Rowan cared about very much, and when Rowan turned around, Maddie was no longer in the hallway where she had just been standing. The truth was that only a few minutes earlier, when Maddie had stepped out to the hospital's courtyard parking lot to get a breath of fresh air and escape the suffocating anxiety of the waiting room, someone had ambushed her from the shadows. Before she could scream or react, she was forced into an unmarked vehicle and driven away from the hospital to an old abandoned warehouse in the industrial district on the edge of the city, where Silas was already waiting with the frighteningly calm smile of a man who had calculated every move. He had chosen the exact time, the exact moment when Rowan was most distracted, most bound in place, to strike. But what Silas hadn't expected, just as he hadn't expected that night in the banquet room that a housekeeper would dare run into the path of a bullet, was that the woman sitting before him was not someone who gave up easily. Maddie understood very clearly that her life was the only card Silas had to force Rowan's hand, that as long as she still had value, he wouldn't harm her yet, and that her task now was not to weep and beg, but to buy time, as much time as she could, so Rowan could find her. So instead of panicking, she forced herself to breathe more slowly, and she began to talk. She asked Silas questions, pretending to be curious, pretending she wanted to understand, pressing on the very wound he had exposed, asking whether he had endured too many years in the shadows, whether he felt he had never been given the recognition he deserved. And Silas, who had carried that bitterness for far too long without ever having anyone listen to it, was drawn into explaining himself more than he had intended. Every minute that passed inside his story was another precious minute Maddie managed to seize. At the same time, while she spoke, she quietly observed the warehouse around her, memorizing the positions of the exits, counting his men, noticing the phone he had left loosely on a wooden crate nearby. And when he became absorbed in the bitter current of his own memories, she skillfully knocked over a stack of empty metal bins nearby, pretending she had staggered because she was afraid, creating a loud crash that echoed through the whole warehouse. A signal, a trace. Anything that might help the people looking for her find this place. "You're stalling, aren't you?" Silas said, his eyes sharpening when he realized what she was doing, though there was still a reluctant trace of respect in his voice. "Rowan really does know how to choose people. You're not like the others. I'll admit that. I'm only a mother trying to survive so I can get back to my child," Maddie answered. And this time she wasn't acting at all, because at that very moment, not far away, inside the brightly lit operating wing of the hospital, Posey's small heart was in the hands of the people fighting to heal it, and the thought that her little girl might wake up and not find her mother there brought a fear greater than any fear she had for her own life, giving her a resilience even Silas had not expected. "Whatever you do to me," she said, lifting her head and looking straight at him, "you should know you were wrong about one thing. You think Rowan saw you as a shadow, but you're the one who turned yourself into a shadow by choosing this path. A person who is truly valued doesn't murder the one who trusted him." Her words made Silas's face darken for a moment, and at that exact instant, from outside the warehouse, came the sound of cars racing toward them. The noise Maddie had deliberately made was not for nothing, because Rowan's men, following the few faint clues, along with the surveillance network he had spread across the city from the day he brought mother and daughter under his protection, had narrowed the search to that abandoned industrial district. And when the cars braked hard in front of the warehouse, the first person to step out, walking ahead of even his most seasoned men, was Rowan Vance himself. Those who knew him knew that he was a man who never allowed emotion to overrun reason, that his most frightening strength lay in his ability to remain cold as ice even in the most desperate situations. But tonight, thinking of Maddie in the hands of the man who had once aimed a gun at him, something inside him had cracked, and for the first time, the men who came with him saw his usual composure mingled with something far more violent, a fear of loss he had not allowed himself to feel for so many years. He stepped into the warehouse, and the heavy metal door burst open, revealing Silas standing there, still holding the advantage, his men spread out on both sides, and in the middle was Maddie, still holding her head high though her face had gone pale with tension. The moment Rowan's eyes met hers, she saw him give her a small nod, a tiny gesture telling her to stay calm, and then he turned to Silas. When he spoke, his voice had returned to its frightening coldness, but this time, beneath that layer of ice, there was a fire everyone could feel. "You've gone too far, Silas," he said. "I gave you a chance to stop, but you chose to touch someone I will never allow anyone to touch." What happened next unfolded very quickly, with the seamless coordination of men who had spent many years fighting beside one another. Rowan's men spread out into calculated positions, and a struggle erupted inside the warehouse. Shouts, grappling, the sound of bodies colliding in that cramped and shadowed space. Maddie felt a strong hand pull her down behind a large crate, one of Rowan's men shielding her from danger. And from that hiding place, she only managed to glimpse figures moving through the dim light, to hear the chaos rise and then fall, until everything finally ended and silence settled back over the warehouse. When she lifted her head, all of Silas's men had been subdued, and Silas stood there, the upper hand having slipped from his grasp, facing the man he had betrayed. Rowan walked toward him, one step at a time, unhurried, and that lack of hurry was the most terrifying thing of all, because it showed that he was completely in control of the situation, completely holding the fate of the man before him in his hands. The two men looked at each other for a long moment, and in Rowan's eyes there was both the pain of betrayal and the cold decisiveness of a man who had already delivered his final judgment. 15 years, Rowan said quietly. "I considered you my own brother. That's what makes this difficult. But you aimed at a mother and a child, and because of that, there's nothing left to say." What happened next, Maddie did not see, because the man protecting her deftly turned her away and led her toward the door. All she knew was that when she stepped out into the cool night air, Silas's story had ended in the way of the world Rowan belonged to, a world with its own rules and its own prices to be paid, and she chose not to look any deeper into it. A little later, Rowan came out after her, And when he saw that she was safe, something in the rigid tension of his posture finally loosened. He strode toward her and placed both hands on her shoulders as if to make sure she was truly standing there, truly unharmed. "Are you all right?" he asked, and in his voice there was still the trembling echo of the fear he had just lived through. "I'm all right," Maddie answered, and then suddenly remembering, she gripped his arm tightly, her eyes widening. "Posey, Roan, she's still in surgery. I have to get back to her. Right now." And without another word, he led her toward the car, because he understood that although tonight's battle was over, Maddie's most important battle was still continuing in a brightly lit room not far away. The car sped through the night at a pace only empty late-hour roads would allow, and the whole way, Maddie sat gripping Rowan's hand, her eyes fixed on the streetlights sliding past the window, her heart torn between the relief of having escaped the warehouse and the gnawing fear for the child lying on the operating table. Rowan did not say much. He only tightened his hand around hers every time he felt her tremble, a steady, silent presence beside her in the hour when she needed it most. When they reached the hospital and ran along the brightly lit corridors toward the waiting area outside the operating room, the indicator light above the door was still glowing, which meant the surgery was still underway, and Maddie sank into the waiting chair, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes never leaving that closed door. The minutes passed heavily, as if time itself had thickened, each tick of the wall clock sounding like a drumbeat in the silence of the waiting area, and Maddie found herself praying, silently and desperately, with everything left in her exhausted heart. She prayed for that door to open with good news. She prayed for the small child she had sacrificed everything for to be returned to her whole. Rowan sat down beside her, and though he was not a man accustomed to words of comfort, he still slipped an arm around her shoulders and let her rest her head against him. And in that moment, as two people held their breath together and waited, every distance between their worlds disappeared completely, leaving only two hearts turned toward one small life behind that door. Then at last, after what felt endless, the indicator light went out, the door opened, and the surgeon stepped out, still wearing her surgical scrubs. She pulled down her mask, and on her tired face was a smile, the kind of smile Maddie would remember for the rest of her life. "The surgery was a complete success," she said, and those words seemed to throw open another door inside Maddie's chest. "Her heart has been repaired now, and all her numbers look very encouraging. She's a strong little girl. She'll need time to recover, but I believe she'll grow up healthy and be able to run and play like any other child. You may see her when she wakes up." Maddie burst into tears, this time not tears of despair or fear, but tears of a happiness so vast her heart could not contain it. And she turned to Rowan, burying her face against his shoulder as she sobbed, while he held her tightly, and if she had lifted her eyes to look, she would have seen that even in the steel-gray eyes of that man, there was a rare glimmer of something bright. A little while later, when they were allowed in to see her, Maddie stepped carefully to the bedside where Posey was lying, and the little girl, hearing the familiar sound of her mother's footsteps, slowly opened her eyes. When she recognized her mother's face leaning over her, a weak but radiant smile bloomed on her lips. "Mommy," the child whispered, her voice tiny with exhaustion. "I woke up. My chest doesn't feel tired anymore." Maddie took her daughter's small hand and pressed it against her cheek, tears falling as her mouth smiled, and she softly answered that yes, sweetheart, from now on, you won't ever have to feel that tired anymore. You'll run fast and play as much as you want. Mommy promises." Posey smiled contentedly at that promise, then looked toward Rowan, who stood at the foot of the bed, and she gave him a small wave with her tiny hand. "Mister, come here with me and Mommy," she said. And Rowan, the most powerful man in the city, stepped toward that small hospital bed with a tender hesitation, and for the first time in many years, he felt that he belonged somewhere, that he belonged to something greater than all the power he had spent his life building. That autumn passed, then winter, and when the first rays of spring sunshine returned to warm the garden behind the mansion, Posey had fully recovered, running between the newly blooming flower beds with bright, ringing laughter that filled the air, her cheeks rosy again, her little heart now healthy, beating with the steady rhythm of the childhood she should have had all along. And every time Maddie watched her daughter run without having to stop to catch her breath, her own heart filled with a gratitude no words could ever fully hold. Her life had changed in ways she never would have dared imagine 1 year earlier, but the greatest change was not in the grand house or in the safety that she and her daughter had finally found. It was inside Maddie herself, the woman who had once been used to folding herself into a shadow in rooms that didn't belong to her, who had grown used to lowering her head and making herself small just to survive, now stood with her back straight. She had learned to raise her voice. She had learned that a person's worth had never been measured by the uniform they wore or the money in their pocket, but by what they chose to do when no one forced them to do it. As for Rowan, the man whose name had once been spoken across the city with fear, was also quietly rewriting his own story, step by step dismantling the darker parts of the empire he had inherited, gradually moving his affairs onto cleaner and more transparent paths, closing the old chapters he no longer wanted to belong to, because he had found a reason to become better than the man circumstance had shaped him into. And that reason was sitting right in front of him in the sunlit garden, smiling as she watched her daughter play. He no longer looked at Maddie as someone he needed to protect, or as a debt he had to repay, but as an equal, as the woman who had taught him that true strength did not lie in the ability to make others afraid, but in the courage to remain kind in a world that was always trying to wear kindness down. And when she caught his gaze across the yard, she no longer looked down and turned away as she once had. She simply smiled back, the smile of two people who had walked through storms together and found in each other a home they had both believed they would never have. The story of Maddie and Rowan, in the end, is a story about the simplest and deepest truth in this life, that kindness given without expecting anything in return has the power to reach even hearts that seem to have turned to stone, that no one is invisible, and no life is too small to change another person's entire world, and that human dignity is something no one can grant or take away, because it has always lived in the way we choose to treat one another. If today's story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video with the people you love, so that each day we can continue listening together to meaningful and heartwarming stories about human kindness. How do you feel about Maddie and Rowan's journey? What part of this story moved you the most? Please leave a comment below and share what you feel from the deepest place in your heart, because we always cherish and look forward to reading every line you share with us. Thank you for spending your time with us until the very last moment. May you and the people you love always be blessed with abundant health, and may your life be joyful, peaceful, and filled with happiness every day. Goodbye for now, and see you again in the next stories.